Welcome to PREPclips. Today we're going to talk a little bit about high wind events and tornadoes and what you might do immediately after the event. We're at the scene of a location where we recently had a tornado go through. The first priority is always life safety. If necessary, dial 911 and get some help moving your way. If you have any severely injured folks, do not move them unless it's absolutely necessary. After event, if you know there are wires down that are likely hot, they should be treated as though they are, and keep other people away from those. If you can safely do so, turn off any gas, power, and water to any damaged building. In this case, there is a very clearly marked panel, and the power has been turned off to the damaged barn. So if you can safely do that, you can safely get to that, that's a great idea. The homeowner has a backup generator. It can be isolated from the utility company by simply pulling this lever down and switching to backup power on the generator. Report all major damage to 911 immediately. They will take that information, push it on up to the National Weather Service that they will eventually use to extend or increase their warning. Generally, stay out of any damaged buildings and check on any neighbors that may need assistance. Before engaging in any cleanup or damage assessment, make sure you're protected with the proper PPE to include heavy clothing, footwear, gloves, and eye protection. Be cautious after any storm event, as there are many hazards. Some of those may not be immediately obvious to you. There are many jagged edges on metal, wood, nails protruding through debris, and be cautious of any structural damage. It's just a perfect example of some hazards that may exist after the tornado or the high wind event. In this case, the wagon is overturned. It's here now. Certainly it is not stable, and certainly you wouldn't want anyone to be around this until you can get this corrected. Resist the urge to clean up until the area has been photographed and your insurance company has been notified. Nearly 50% of injuries at these events occur after the wind event or the tornado during the cleanup process. If you're using a chainsaw to cut a limb or branch that has twisted, that stored energy can be released as you cut that, and you could put yourself in harm's way. Be mindful of any flammable liquids or gases that may have spilled, or any hazardous materials that may have spilled prior to entering those areas. Check on any pets or livestock that may have been injured, and check to see that fences are still intact.
My name is Bill Field, and we moved out here in the country in rural Indiana and purchased this farm in 1992. And we've had a couple of tornadoes come through that we could see off to the distance. But on June 25th of this year, we had one that visited us personally. It just came right through the middle of our trees, struck our barn, and did an awful lot of damage to the farm, the property, injured a couple of head of livestock, and it just changed our world for a few hours as we were trying to assess exactly what had taken place. We're a small farm, and we raise belted Galloway cattle for showing and for breeding purposes. And we have a flock of chickens. We try to do things ourselves, and it's sort of been a kind of a growing place for our family, our kids, and so forth. For the last 40 years, I've trained volunteer firefighters and emergency workers on responding to agricultural incidents, and I've never been on this side of the fence before. My first response was, is everybody okay? And I think we need to recognize that everything that was damaged was property, it was things, and what we need to focus on are the people. And so the attention was given immediately to finding out where everybody was anybody hurt, and begin to address those critical questions first. And then my main concern was let's not become a secondary victim, because I didn't know if there were power lines down, I didn't know if there were buildings that were unstable, we didn't know how much damage was done to the house or anything, is to check everything out to make sure that there was nothing that was going to be hazardous. We suddenly had a lot of people coming to the scene, and I'm still the property owner, and so I was concerned about, what people were going to contact, if there were open lines. All the lights were on in the barn, even though much of it was destroyed, so we knew there was still power to the building. And so we were concerned about any exposure to any bare wires or anything that might have caused an electrocution. We were fortunate that nothing was damaged on the power line structure that came to the house, the poles, or none of that. Everything was working, and so we still had electricity, but that concerned me that there might be power that to some of our features on the operation that might have caused an electrocution. The next step was, probably it was my daughter's first step, was to check the well-being of the animals, the livestock, the pets. We have 5 cats, 3 dogs, about 20 head of cattle, breeding cattle, and other chickens and so forth. Is that there was a concern that some of them might have been injured, and it turned out that we had 2 that were injured. We had one that needed veterinarian care. Obviously was struck by flying materials, and so we focused attention, and that was really motivated because my wife and daughter really care about their animals, and so that became a high priority over cleanup. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay. So then once we started to clean up, the next morning early, we had a lot of people showing up. We had people volunteer, they're wood chippers, they came with chainsaws and everything, and I'm still, again, the property owner, and I was concerned about, is everybody equipped and prepared to run all this equipment? I've read the statistics that about half of the injuries from a tornado like this are caused by cleanup. They occur when people start cutting tree limbs or start moving things, and next thing you know, they become a secondary victim. So I really worked hard to try to keep the volunteers that came safe. I'm really thankful for those volunteers. They came from a mile away. They knew it was our barn because some of our barn was landed in their front yard, and they was bringing it back as, I guess, tokens. I asked them if they could keep it if they wanted it, but we knew that there were people quite a ways away that knew our barn, and some of our property was gone because it was being dispersed onto their property. And so I really tried during that day to make sure that we didn't have people doing things that were beyond their skill levels. I didn't want anybody up in trees. I didn't want anybody on ladders. I didn't want anybody in the barns, and so that was a concern that I had there. Even though some still wanted to go, we had a lot of gawkers too. A lot of people stopped in. We had people come in and wanted to buy the lumber out of the barn, and we haven't even figured out what to do yet. So we've put a lot of work into our barn and our property and so forth. And now with some of it destroyed or damaged really severely, it gives you a time to sit down and say, is this what you want to continue doing? So establishing some newer priorities might be a valuable opportunity for anyone that goes through an experience like this, to give them just some time to reassess what's important. And so we're in the process of having some contractors come, and we're maybe considering how we might reconfigure the barn. The barn was built prior to 1880, and so what was done in 1880 is very different than what we do today. So we're considering how we might make it more functional for today's application that we have. One of the things that I found that we often overlooked during a disaster is some of the very basics, like having working flashlights. It just amazed me that night, we ended up being up until midnight, that several of our flashlights, the batteries were dead. They were there, they were visible, but when I picked them up to use them and turn them on, they were dead. And so it took us some time to get some batteries and put them in there. We had extra batteries. I just think one of the things that we ought to be prepared for are those very simple things that can provide you protection when you're trying to get out of a situation, or you're outside trying to assess damages. So a simple little flashlight, having flashlights at critical locations, like by your bedstand, by each of your doors, wherever you're going in and out of the house, might turn out to be a valuable tool in the long run. One of the things that I struggle with when I see volunteers that came to our place, and plus some of my own personal experiences, most of these people aren't geared up to come to us to a recovery or to clean up. They come as they were. And so we had people showing up in Bermuda shorts and flip-flops and everything to try to help us out. And in our particular case, my daughter was concerned about her cattle and left the house in her bare feet and rounded up our entire herd of cattle in her bare feet. and got him into a secure pasture, and never realized until sometime close to midnight that she'd either stepped on a nail or something and had done some damage to her foot. So we ended up having to take her into urgent care. She had to have a tetanus shot and treated and soaked and so forth, because we wanted to avoid an infection. But she never even felt it, because I think the adrenaline was flowing and she was really concerned about her cattle, and they were scattered. And so we often take on tasks like that without thinking about our own personal safety, and we need to remember that. So whenever you're doing cleanup, having the right footwear, having appropriate gloves, because a lot of glass, we had glass strewn everywhere. And that's why we ended up bringing out our shop vacs and vacuuming off the lawn. We had footwear that we could wear when we were out there cleaning up, because any of our material is pretty filled with nails. And I just wanted to use an illustration here. This is a corner piece on our barn that traveled about a mile through the air. And you can imagine this going at 90 miles an hour and hitting somebody or hitting an animal or whatever. And it's held on by about 25 3-inch screws approximately. And there's screws in, and they're all gone. But here's an example of, this is out in the field, or it might be just on your front yard. It might be anywhere. Stepping on that could be a real traumatic experience. And it's just not necessary if you're wearing the right footwear that provides protection to the bottom of your feet. The other thing is that a lot of this stuff has really sharp edges, where it's been not just broken but ripped, and that becomes just almost razor sharp, and it'll lacerate your hands just picking it up. That's why wearing gloves is really, really important. These are magnets on wheels, and we went over the entire everywhere. We had even some of the younger volunteers pushing these everywhere, and it was amazing what we picked up, because so much of the sheet metal on the barn was just literally ripped off. And in this particular case that I showed you with the corner piece, there were 20-some screws, and there's only one left. So those screws all went somewhere, and as I'm walking, I still find them. They're everywhere. Here's an example of just a hand magnet, and we went around. It just amazes me what the stuff we picked up. Some of it old screws, old nails, bolts, things that probably were there before, but we just never knew they were there. But some of it was broke free from some of the parts of the barn, some of the equipment out there. And I think that's an illustration of what you don't want to hit with your lawnmower. Now I'm on the other side of the fence, watching all of this take place, the emergency response folks. One of the first persons that were on the scene was our county sheriff, then our director of emergency management, and then numerous firefighters and family friends and so forth all came, and it was just interesting to watch it happen, not as a participant of that response, but as a recipient.
For more information, visit the website and/or contact your local emergency management director.